Hi everybody, and welcome to this revision video on research methods as part of Stage 2 Psychology, Science Inquiry Skills, or SIS. Let's get started. So, research methods in psychology refers to the type of data that's collected. So, the tools or techniques psychologists use to obtain data is the method, all right, or the way, in other words, in which we gather the data. So what we actually get is a research method, and then that will determine the type of data that we obtain from our experiments or our investigations. So this is separate to the designs, which I talk about in a previous video. So the design is the way or how the experiment or investigation is set up. The method is the type of data that we obtain from those experiments or observations or qualitative discussions. So there are three types of research method in psychology: objective quantitative, subjective quantitative, and qualitative. Let's go into these in a bit more detail. So we need to obviously figure out what these terms mean, because they do sound similar, and I sympathize with that, but it's very, very easy to confuse the terms. So let's just do a little bit of a refresher and go through what each of these terms actually means. So if we're gathering objective data, or the word objective, I should say, means that data is free from any personal bias or opinion or interpretation. So in other words, we can't object to them, hence the term. So if they're objective, they're free from any personal opinion or bias, and we can verify them in a scientific way. Whereas subjective, that means that it can be altered by opinions, bias, personal interpretations, etc. So they are subject to bias or subject to opinion or interpretation. Again, hence the term. So we can't verify these in other ways, and they are based on or caused by someone's opinion or own biases, which is still useful in psychology, because if we want to get someone's opinion on something, obviously we're going to get subjective data, which is fine. But sometimes we need to be mindful that some of the results that we intended to be objective are altered by a subjective factor, which I'll talk about later. Now, quantitative is any data that's in number form. So this might include heart rates, heights, weights, reaction times, etc. But any data that's measured in numbers is quantitative. Whereas qualitative is any data that's not numbers, basically. So any other data that's using words, language, children's drawings, or pictures is qualitative data. So again, any data that's not numbers, basically, is qualitative, whereas any data that is numbers is quantitative. So remember the trick: quantitative, N for numbers; qualitative, L for language. Okay, let's go through some examples and types of each one, starting with objective quantitative measures. So we just went through the definitions of what these terms mean. So objective, all right, so free from any bias, and quantitative is numbers. So we know that we get numerical data and it's factual, all right? So an easier way to think of this term is factual numbers. So examples of common ways that we get objective quantitative measures or objective quantitative data, or factual numbers, in other words, these three here. Let's go through them. So we've got standardized tests. So these are scores on tests that have the same meaning with the same questions, and they're used the same way on each occasion. An example of this would be a maths test or a psychology exam or an IQ test. Okay, so it has the same meaning, the same questions, and it's used the same way with the same intention, which is to obviously measure the knowledge and understanding of whatever it is that you're being tested on, whether it's a maths test or a psychology exam, whatever. So that is a standardized test. This is also, or this process is referred to as standardization. So obviously this, lends itself to the tests that you've done over the years at school. So maths tests, psychology tests, physics tests, whatever, science tests, obviously. They're used the same way with the same questions, and yeah, are used the same way on each occasion. All right, so this is standardization by using standardized tests. There are other examples of standardized tests as well, like IQ tests and NAPLAN and things like that. So when we apply this to psychology, we may give our participants a standardized test that may be measuring, their knowledge and understanding on, a particular topic, for example. Another example that's very common in psychology is any physiological measure. So these are measures of bodily function. So heart rates, galvanic skin response, which is sweating, blood pressure measures, etc. So sometimes when we gather physiological measures, we actually use a polygraph machine. Now, this is incorrectly sometimes referred to as a lie detector test. Those of you that did year 11 psychology with me will know how I feel about that term. They're not accurate in determining if someone is lying or not. All it does is measure physiological responses. But they can be useful, and they do have their place in that respect. So we will use polygraph machines to measure physiological responses like heart rate, blood pressure, galvanic skin response. Absolutely. Now, the reason why these are objective quantitative is because obviously the numbers, or the results we get, I should say, are in number form. So heart rates, 80 beats per minute, 100 beats per minute, etc. Blood pressure, 120 over 80, whatever the case may be. It's in number form. But because they are free from any bias or free from any opinion, they are objective. So we've got actual measures that we can verify by a heart rate machine or blood pressure machine, where we know and we can be confident that results are not being influenced in some way. Also, we've got behavior counts, okay? So a specific behavior frequency is recorded during a given period of time. So in other words, we simply count how many times a person or an animal does a specific behavior that we're actually targeting. So if someone threw a chair 10 times, they threw a chair 10 times. We can verify it, all right, because we're counting how many times they've done it. There's no subjectivity involved. Now, subjective quantitative measures are different. So still quantitative, so still in number form, but they are subject to bias, all right? And often they're designed to be purposefully rigged that way. So the most common example of subjective quantitative measures are rating scales. Now, I have no doubt that you would have done a rating scale at some point on a particular topic. They are considered subjective quantitative measures in psychology. So participants select their responses from a fixed statement, all right? This is often called a Likert scale. These are frequently used. So this is the example that was in year 11 psych. I used the same one in year 12 psych. So psychology is awesome. And then your attitude or your opinion or your bias, in other words, is attributed to a particular number. So 1 is strongly agree, 2 is agree, 3, yeah, haven't made up my mind yet, neutral, 4, disagree, 5, strongly disagree. So if I was to give everybody this question, all right, I would then get a whole bunch of numbers back. Okay, so I might get some 1s, some 2s, hopefully no 5s, but you know what I mean. So we're still getting numerical data, so we're still getting quantitative data back, but it's subject to your opinion of your attitude of if psychology is awesome or not. So it's subject to bias, hence subjective quantitative. So any time, in other words, we use a rating scale on our participants, it is a subjective quantitative measure because it's subject to their own bias depending on how they feel about that statement and to what extent they agree with it or not. Other examples that are very similar are self-reports, okay, with fixed response answers, so yes or no questions, multiple choice answers, rating scales. They allow the opportunity to ask the same questions of a large portion of people, but obviously the results are going to be influenced by their subjective opinion. So obviously we can count how many yeses we've got, how many no's we've got, how many A, B, C, or D answers we've got, but it's obviously going to vary depending on the subjectivity of that individual or individuals. Now, to a point, observations can be subjective as well. So behavior counts, what I just talked about, is objective, as we know. Sometimes when we do behavioral observations, there can be some subjectivity involved. So researchers using a scale or a checklist will observe targeted behavior from their own perspective. So the subjectivity comes in from the observer's observations, I should say. So it might be, you know, if they're rating a particular behavior of anger from 1 to 5, they may give it a 3, but then another expert may give it a 1. So yes, we're still getting quantitative, and yes, we're observing behavior, but the actual interpretation of the targeted behavior may change depending on the individual, subject to their own interpretation of it. So what are some advantages and disadvantages of getting quantitative data? So whether it's objective or subjective. Advantages. Usually they're done in controlled conditions, so more likely to be valid. So when we get particularly objective quantitative data, they're done usually in an experimental design. So they're more likely to be valid, which means they're more likely to be accurate. Leading on from that, they can be directly verified if they're objective. So again, that improves validity. So we can be sure that the results have been measured as accurately as possible. And there's no opinion or bias involved. We can get substantial data in a very short amount of time. This is particularly relevant for subjective quantitative data. So we can send out, a mass rating scale to a lot of people and get a lot of numbers and results back in a relatively short amount of time. So things like SurveyMonkey, if we've got, a rating scale, we can get a lot of results very, very quickly, which is good. However, they're not perfect, okay? So quantitative data sometimes has disadvantages. It doesn't explain results. It only shows the numbers. So yes, we may get a whole lot of 3s or 4s or 1s or yes or no answers, but it doesn't say why the participants have actually answered in that way. So we get the what of the results, but not the why of results. And of course, if it's subjective quantitative, it still may be biased. So yes, we're getting numerical data, but someone may be very, very opinionated or biased in their answers. So if I go back to this example here, of course, I'm going to say that 1 is the correct answer. So psychology is awesome. Of course, I'm going to say a 1, but because I am the psychology teacher and I've studied it and I've taught it for so many years, I'm very biased with my response. So that can reduce the validity of the results as well. Now, we can also get qualitative data or use qualitative methods. So this is similar to the design, but again, this is the type of data that we actually get. So we can do this in a number of ways with qualitative methods. So we can administer questionnaires, like I said, where the responses are in word and language form. We can conduct interviews, children's drawings, as you can see here, that's data as well, and also descriptions of what someone has said. So any data that's not numbers basically is qualitative. So language, pictures, etc. So sometimes when we're working with children or child psychology, they're not old enough or cognitively developed enough to describe something or, interpret questions or surveys or things like that. So we'll get them to draw a picture of how they feel or what happened or, their interpretation of whatever it is that we're studying or getting their opinion on. So what are some advantages and disadvantages of qualitative research? That should be qualitative, guys. I've just realized that. I'm going to change that because that's really going to annoy me. There we go. Oh, cool. That's better. Okay. So that's still spelt wrong. Oh my goodness. There we go. Okay. My apologies. So, advantages and disadvantages of qualitative research. So, provides rich, deep, and verbal data about a research topic. So we can get lots of qualitative information with a lot of responses. We can also get expert opinion with the Delphi technique. I've talked about that in my previous video, and that makes the data more likely to be reliable. Even though it's in word and language form, it's more likely that we can depend on the results if it's using the Delphi technique. It's very useful if little is known about a topic again, so it's a researcher's starting point. Let's talk about what we do know and develop more rigorous tests from there. And we can't obviously do that unless we get the qualitative research first. So there's a myth that qualitative data is worse than quantitative data. Not necessarily. It depends on obviously the area that we're studying at the time. Now, disadvantages, usually quite subjective. Even if using the Delphi technique, there may be some differences depending on what one expert says versus another expert. So it's always going to be subjective. Therefore, validity is always going to be questionable at best. Also, it's unable to be verified in a controlled setting. So even if we do focus groups and we run the show with that, we can't actually verify what the participant has said to be true because we're just taking their word for it. So again, it can lead to a lack of validity and reliability in the results. Okay, so I hope you found this video useful. As always, if you've got any questions, let me know.